Quality, comfort, and grip at an affordable price. Whether it's our standard, pro, or elite socks, there's an option for everyone. Try a pair for yourself now at puregripsocks.com.
The football boot industry has very much become focused around technology, the next big thing to enhance performance. And inside this box is what I personally believe to be an early look at what could be the future of football boots, where the tech and performance is undeniable, but because of how extreme the design is, the question becomes, have they gone too far? Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to what is effectively version 2 of the Adidas F50 Plus, where, to make a long story short, Adidas basically took everyone's feedback from the original, mainly the criticism of only making it available with a laceless upper, and giving the people what they want, a lacing system with a traditional U-throat construction, along with some other minor tweaks that undeniably make this an improved variation of that original design. Having said that, even though Adidas have made most of the changes we were asking for, the boots still retail for a relatively steep $300, making them one of the most expensive top-end football boots currently on the market, and there's no way around it. The Light Strike Pro foam insert underneath the forefoot just makes the F50 Plus look a little bit weird and in a colorway that looks like something Buzz Lightyear would wear. To say the least, it's an extreme take on a speed-focused football boot, which is both a good and bad thing. Where once again, the question that we have to ask is, have they gone too far? Because while there are undeniably some performance benefits to this extreme speed football boot design, there are also some major quirks that come along with it that, to say the least, make the F50 Plus a bit of an acquired taste, and also a big reason why we have seen next to no pro level adoption of this concept and technology. Which is why in today's video, we're gonna go over the good and the bad of the F50 Plus, talk about how they differ from the original variation, take a look at how they fit and feel on feet, and ultimately conclude whether or not you should be embracing the future of football boots right now, or perhaps waiting a little longer. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around, watch the entire review, and if you are interested in a pair for yourself, you can pick them up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the first link down below. So first things first, we need to address what makes the F50 Plus different from the regular variants of the F50, and that is of course the elevated forefoot with that Light Strike Pro insert and the double sole plate construction that makes up this Sprint Frame 360 design. Same name as the normal F50, but completely different in terms of feel, and also significantly stiffer. This element of version 2 of the F50 Plus has not changed from the original. The only thing that they've modified is the upper. In other words, if you were an early adopter of the original F50 Plus and absolutely loved the way that they felt but wished they had a lacing system, while there are a few other differences, that's more or less what version 2 is, which means you're probably really going to like the changes. Where if we focus in on the upper, not only is it different from the F50 Plus that it replaces, it's actually different from all other variants of the F50, more so than the previous generation was, where you'll notice there is no Fiber Touch branding anywhere on the upper, and that's not because this isn't still a variation of that Fiber Touch synthetic. It's still very clearly a textile-based synthetic with an overlay of polyurethane, and then of course your Sprint Web microtexturing on the surface. However, on this boot, it's just much thinner and much less structured, way more pliable, and probably most closely related to the Adidas X Crazy Fast Plus from the previous generation, basically the last speed boot before Adidas brought back the F50 name. Where there's not really a secret as to how Adidas achieved this upper, they just made it thinner than a normal pair of F50s, and the end result is a material that is less structured, more pliable, and honestly, more comfortable on feet than all the other fiber touch uppers on the regular F50 models, simply due to the fact that it's just not as stiff. You could make the argument that because it's less structured, there's maybe a little bit less responsiveness to this upper, even with the laces tied tight. It just has more margin to kind of stretch and roll over the edge of the sole plate, which is going to be more noticeable on the F50 Plus with that elevated forefoot than it otherwise would be on a normal F50 with a standard flat Sprint Frame 360 sole plate. But that is not to say that responsiveness or general stability is necessarily an issue with the F50 Plus. It's just, like I said, noticeably less structured than a normal F50, where if we take a look on the inside, another change that you'll see compared to laced variants of the F50, where obviously we're not talking about the messy version with its hybrid touch upper, that gives you the burrito style tongue, but on a normal F50 with laces, you have this internal kind of stirrup system wrapping the midfoot. Pull the laces up on the F50 Plus and you'll notice that it's a standalone tongue with basically no extra reinforcement along the sides, just a little bit of like a microfiber material acting as a support cage on either side, basically allowing light to pass through this upper, where for the most part, and I'm sure we'll see this in other colorways a little bit better than this launch Buzz Lightyear one, it's virtually translucent. Where if you're looking for the thinnest possible touch, this is about as barefoot as you're going to find in the speed boot category right now. It's certainly the thinnest of all the F50 variants. And then I also really like that Sprint Web micro texture on the surface, which is there in the form of these kind of raised lines that follow the graphics themselves. All the micro texturing is actually found within the F50 logo. So again, as far as strategically placing that micro texture for the sake of better touch and control, I'm sure that they haven't calculated through AI that the F50 logo is the perfect placement for all of this micro texture. It's more so there, again, for the sake of aesthetic. But in terms of what you can actually feel, that micro texture does add that little bit of abrasiveness on the ball that makes the upper not necessarily feel sticky in a Nike grip knit type of way like you'd get from, say, for example, a Nike Mercurial Vapor 16, but more so just not slippery on the surface of the ball, which I actually really like about the F50 in general. From a grip on the ball perspective, despite the upper being a lot thinner, it feels very similar to the regular F50 variants, which again is not a bad thing. However, like every other thin synthetic speed boot, should you get stepped on, there is basically next to no protection on offer here. You are going to feel every bit of your opponent's studs digging into the top of your foot. But that's the sacrifice you choose to make for the sake of feel. Across the top of the foot is where you're going to find perhaps the biggest change with version 2 of the F50 Plus, and that is the fact that this is no longer a laceless product. Instead, it features a central lacing system like other laced variants of the F50 with a more traditional U-throat construction and standalone tongue. That standalone tongue being made from a super thin, completely unstructured microfiber material that I'm not in love with on the basis that it does not retain any shape whatsoever. So especially in these lower areas, when you put the boots on, the tongue has a tendency of kind of folding in on itself and bunching up, and it's more tricky to kind of get it to lay flat across the top of the foot than I was honestly expecting. Once you have it all sorted out though and pull the laces tight, it doesn't seem to be an issue, and I do like it for the fact that it's as thin as the rest of the upper. So in terms of consistency of touch on the ball, even though it's not laceless like the previous version, no matter what part of your foot makes contact with the ball, it is equally as thin. Another interesting quirk of the F50 Plus are the extremely thin laces, which once upon a time we have seen Adidas use back in the F50 Adizero Prime days. But in the case of the F50 Plus, because of how unstructured this tongue is, when you tie the laces tight, they only get even thinner, and you can run into some issues with lace bite, where if you were to replace them with slightly more normal football boot laces that are just going to be a little bit wider, that pressure gets distributed a little bit more evenly, and potentially those lace bite issues go away. This is really only a concern if you're somebody that really ties your laces super tight. And again, we're getting into nitpicking basically the smallest thing. The reason why they went for the super thin laces, I'm sure, is to save as much weight as possible, where they probably were able to shave a gram or two, maybe even 3 with how thin these are. But for a couple bucks, you can replace them and it's really not that big of a deal. Although, do keep in mind that because the laces are so thin, when you tie your boots, especially if you do a double knot like I like to do, that knot can get so small that it almost becomes impossible to untie. So be aware of that the first couple times that you wear these boots, because you might end up getting stuck in them. Moving to the rear, you'll find that everything looks pretty normal as far as the modern F50 is concerned. It's a low-cut construction with a little bit of an extended tail. You have your external heel counter by way of the Sprint Frame 360 sole plate that kind of just wraps over the edge. And then internally, it's a soft microfiber material. However, you might notice that there's a little bit less padding at the back. This is the lowest profile heel liner from a padding perspective out of all the modern F50 models. Since the F50 made its return last year, they have not made this change on the refresh for the normal F50 Elite, but they have made this change for the F50 Plus. I wouldn't say that it makes for any major difference as far as comfort or lockdown is concerned, but it's definitely noticeable that there's just less fluffy cushion at the back of your heel than what you would find on other F50s, including the previous generation F50 Plus. And then the insole, fully removable. I'll give you guys a quick look at that. It is very straightforward in terms of having this really soft kind of microfiber suede liner on the surface, some perforations running through the heel, and then it's made from a single layer of this relatively thin and lightweight foam. And then there's the weight. We're given that both the old and new F50 Plus have the same base, given that Adidas have thinned out the upper, but then added back in a tongue and a lacing system. The question, of course, becomes which one is lighter. Both in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with the laceless F50 Plus, and you can see that they weigh in at a lightweight 6.5 ounces, the equivalent of 184 grams, making this basically the lightest football boot currently on the market. And then as for the new F50 Plus, they weigh in at 6.6 ounces, the equivalent of 187 grams. Meaning that the lightest boot on the market just got 3 grams heavier, which is such a small amount of weight, I'd chalk it down as being pretty insignificant. And then there's the sole plate of the F50 Plus, which, like I mentioned, is unchanged from version 1, and it's one that I've talked about on this channel at length quite a few times now. From a technical perspective, it's the most responsive sole plate on the market. It does the best job of putting you on your toes, and in terms of making you feel like you are legitimately going to be faster, I'm not sure that anything does a better job. The Puma Ultra Carbon, whether it's the 5 or the 6, does come pretty close in terms of giving you that extreme underfoot sensation, but at the same time, it's very different from a feel perspective when compared to this, and somehow just a lot more normal feeling, where obviously with the F50 Plus, the elephant in the room is this giant chunk of foam, Light Strike Pro to be specific, that is inserted underneath the forefoot on both the lateral and the medial side, which elevates your forefoot, puts you kind of on the balls of your feet, and is supposed to allow for that little bit of energy return with every single stride forward. In order to house this material though, they've created a double sole plate construction where there's a piece of plastic that runs above the foam and then a piece of plastic that runs below, which is where the studs are anchored to. The end result being a Sprint Frame 360 sole plate that looks from the bottom a lot like the normal F50, but when you actually go to flex it, and it's very noticeable on feet, it's extremely stiff. It is hard to bend when it's just in your hands. Where if there was no ball and we were just running on grass, this would be the football boot to have, because I really do think that this introduces that kind of high-end race running shoe type of feel in a football boot platform unlike anything else we have ever seen. It's hard to say that that responsiveness is genuinely going to make you quicker, but certainly it is incredibly noticeable in terms of how it impacts every single step that you take in these football boots. However, football is not just a game of running around. You actually have to touch the ball. And what makes this so weird for a lot of people is, again, this elevated forefoot with this giant chunk of foam basically in the one spot on both the outside and the inside of your foot that is constantly making contact with the ball. Where surprisingly, it's not as hard to get used to as I think a lot of people might expect. Of course, your mileage may vary and everyone's going to be a little bit more sensitive to this type of thing. Until you try it for yourself, it's really difficult for me to tell you that it's something you're going to love or hate or basically not be able to get used to. But for me, it's something that when I stopped thinking about it, I stopped noticing it for the most part. However, you definitely can tell that there's something different in the forefoot sole plate area of this football boot compared to anything else every once in a while. It just feels different. And I think that's part of the reason why we haven't seen pro adoption of the F50 Plus, where obviously the fact that it's been laceless has not necessarily helped its case, because I think there are still plenty of pros that want to wear a laced variation. But even now that this is available, it must be said that this platform only allows for an FG stud pattern. So in the event that a pro would need a soft ground layout, they would actually have to switch back to a standard sole plate, which would completely change their underfoot feel. And I would think that most pro players are looking for consistency rather than having to basically change their football boots depending on the playing surface. But that's not really as much of an issue for the average consumer. If you're buying a pair of F50 Pluses, they're probably your only football boots or part of a rotation because you're always tinkering around with trying new things anyway. So I wouldn't worry too much about the variation in feel going from these to something else, unless again, you are really picky and have a hard time getting used to something new. If that's you, these probably aren't going to be your cup of tea. But what personally I like so much about this technology, especially given that it is more or less the first generation of this concept and that we've never really had an elevated forefoot football boot, is that it's super noticeable. We get marketed on all platforms 24 hours a day, every single day of the year. And we're always trying to be sold on these new technologies that the latest football boots have that are going to improve your performance. And then once you actually get them, you realize none of that tech you can actually feel, or at least very little of it. In the case of the F50 Plus, you put these on your feet and without even taking a step, you've noticed that these are significantly different from everything else. And that to me is super impressive and what makes the F50 Plus such a unique experience in the world of football boots, hence why they really do feel like the future, but right now. Unfortunately for Adidas though, it's still a big enough change with that elevated forefoot where not everyone is going to be sold on the concept, and the fact that these boots retail for $300 also mean that you are effectively picking these over every single alternative option to potentially not like the way that they feel. So there's no beating around the bush in saying that if you're buying a pair of F50 Plus, either with laces or without, you're taking a chance on potentially not liking something that genuinely does feel very different from everything else. Sole plate tech aside, if you are going for the F50 Plus, your only option is going to be the FG stud pattern, which as you can see from a stud layout and shaping perspective is pretty well the same as every other variant of the F50. And just like those other F50 variants, it offers a really nice blend of aggressive traction and plenty of bite closer to the tip of the toe, and then that kind of freedom to twist and pivot with more rounded style studs underneath the base of the forefoot, blades under the heel for great overall stability. And as far as speed boot traction is concerned on firm natural grass, I think this does a really nice job and works well with what the F50 is supposed to represent, even though the F50 Plus is kind of the most extreme representation of what an F50 could be. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, the F50 Plus is actually a remarkably comfortable football boot considering how thin and light they are, but at the same time, the underfoot feel is undeniably strange compared to every other football boot, where your forefoot sits higher than your heel. It almost feels like you're tilted backwards a little bit when you're standing on hard ground, which I think is a major strike against this football boot from a first impressions try-on perspective, because we live in a day and age where the vast majority of us are not getting to try our boots on before we buy them. We're ordering them online, waiting in anticipation, and then we get them on our feet and we're just super excited to give them a go. I've always recommended that if you put a pair of football boots on out of the box and they don't feel right, they might not be the right boots for you. Utilize that return or exchange policy with the place that you bought them from. However, in the case of the F50 Plus, it really is one of those boots that you need to play in to kind of understand what this Soleplate tech is all about. Until you're actually running around and being put on the balls of your feet and feeling the responsiveness of this Soleplate, it's really difficult to get a feel as to whether or not you are going to like this elevated forefoot or absolutely hate it. Assuming you do end up liking that elevated forefoot feel, which personally I'm a fan of. I actually think it's really comfortable. It's giving you that little bit of underfoot cushion under the balls of your feet that other football boots wouldn't necessarily provide. I suppose the zoom unit on the Mercurial would be something somewhat similar, but at the end of the day, these feel very different. The Soleplate is incredibly stiff, but at the same time, it bends pretty well perfectly with your foot to where it feels firm, but doesn't feel restrictive, giving you that really responsive underfoot sensation. And in general, the boots just feel fast. I will say the elevated forefoot is not my favorite as it relates to changes of direction, just because you are that little bit higher. So again, stability, especially depending on the playing surface, if the ground is a little bit harder, might not be ideal here, which again, I think is part of the reason why we haven't seen a lot of pros necessarily adopt this technology. But if you like the way that they feel, and given that conditions are correct, I really do think there is a positive experience to be had from the F50 Plus and this Soleplate tech. And speaking on version 2, the lacing system, the adjustability, all of it just makes for a huge improvement over the first generation laceless variant, which also fit really well, don't get me wrong, but having that extra lockdown and adjustability definitely makes the world of difference in terms of how these boots fit and feel on feet, especially if the laceless design of the original just didn't work well for your foot type. The adjustability is a welcome change. In terms of overall width, despite this being a really thin, kind of raw feeling speed boot, they're really comfortable and actually have some decent width to them. I would say they struck a really nice balance of width and volume with this particular pair, where again, because that upper is so thin and pliable, it's very malleable once you tie the laces tight, allowing it to adjust to the shape of your foot, regardless of how wide or narrow it might be. Obviously, if you have exceptionally wide feet, these probably aren't going to be a great option for you, but for the vast majority of people, they have plenty of width pretty much all the way through and should work out quite nicely. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these boots in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So just like all the other F50 models, if you're looking to get a pair for yourself, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. So in conclusion, just like I said with the laceless F50 Plus, I'm really impressed with the Soleplate tech of these football boots. It genuinely feels totally different from anything else that we've had in the past. And in terms of feeling like they enhance performance, feeling like they're more responsive, and feeling like they put you on the balls of your feet and allow you to move more quickly, there really isn't anything else like it. However, because it's still such an extreme take on a football boot design, even though Adidas have gone and made all of the changes that we were asking for to the upper of the F50 Plus compared to the original laceless model, it's still one of those football boots that's expensive and very much an acquired taste, where if you are going to be pulling the trigger on a $300 pair of F50 Pluses, there's still that chance that you won't like the way that they feel, you won't get used to them, and they're just not going to be your cup of tea. We're going back a long way here, but back in 2008 when Puma launched the V108 speed boots, they had these ads of Samuel Eto'o and a bunch of their star players at the time basically wearing the future of Puma speed boots, which weren't really boots, but actually legs that were shaped like a gazelle. That is what I think of when I see this design. It's such an extreme take on what a football boot could be, and from a technology perspective, it's just so cool to see and so impressive that it works and feels as good as I think it does. But at the same time, I do know that it's just not going to be for everybody. So it's hard for me to say for certain that this is a great speed boot that everyone's going to like, where I feel more comfortable recommending it as an extra pair of football boots for somebody that has the money to spend, is intrigued by football boot tech, and just wants to try something really unique. If that's you, I think these are definitely worth a go. But if they're your only pair of football boots and you know you're a little bit picky, they might not be the best choice. If you're not sold on the concept just by looking at them, I'm not sure that wearing them is going to change your mind.